Okay, so now we're going to transition into your time during the war. Where did you've already stated for the recording where you served, but if you could just talk about it again, where you served in Vietnam?
Yeah, well, to digress just a little bit, or a little background, I was in Virginia Beach, Oceana, undergoing transition training to the F-4. At that point, the Vietnam War was, the general feeling was that things are scaling down. The peace negotiations were still going on, had been going on since 1968, I guess, even though it was 4 years later. East Coast carriers at that point were going to the Mediterranean and on their deployments and everything, not so much to Vietnam. Well, in the spring of 1972, President Nixon resumed the bombing of North Vietnam. The peace negotiations weren't really going anywhere. They seemed to be stalled. And so he resumed the bombing of North Vietnam on a large scale. Now, the Navy needed 2 more carriers, like right now. And the Saratoga, USS Saratoga and the USS America were both East Coast carriers, but were ready to deploy. In fact, the Saratoga was due to go to the Mediterranean, so they changed its destination. I finished my replacement training several weeks after that, and was assigned to Fighter Squadron 31, VF-31, which was on the Saratoga. So I joined the Saratoga over in the Tonkin Gulf. Reported aboard, went through the squadron indoctrination, and then right into flying. Sorry, what was the question?
Where you served in Vietnam?
Okay, we were on the Saratoga, and I would say about 95% of our flying was into North Vietnam. The other 5% being into South Vietnam in support of ground operations there. But our flights into North Vietnam, we would launch from the carrier and do our mission and come back and recover aboard the carrier. So as far as where we actually served, it was aboard the carrier in the Tonkin Gulf, primarily off the coast of North Vietnam.
Could you give us any details on your trip over to Vietnam? What was the carrier life like? Something like that.
Well, like I said, I joined the squadron over there. So when I left Oceana, stored my car someplace, and stored most of my personal belongings at the Bachelor Officers' Quarters. Was flown commercially to Washington National, from there to St. Louis, St. Louis to Springfield, Missouri, where I spent 2 nights. Then back to, left Springfield, flew to Kansas City to San Francisco. And after spending a night in San Francisco, my sister was based there. At that time, she was flying for American. Reason I went to San Francisco is because of the north end of the bay there was Travis Air Force Base. and that was a military airlift command. And from there I was flown to, let's see, to Honolulu, refueled, flew to Guam, then to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and then I guess to Subic Bay Naval Air Station, again in the Philippines, and from there out to the Saratoga. All in the course of about 5 days, or something like that, to that effect. It was kind of hard to describe that trip out there. I do remember that as this we departed Travis Air Force Base, and the plane taking up its westerly course. And I do remember looking down and seeing the west coast pass under the aircraft, the shoreline, wondering if I would ever see it again. Just a thought that occurred. The rest of it was just a very boring, tedious flight. Most military airlift command flights are not designed for comfort.
Just a quick clarification question. Did you fly any of the stretch with your in the F4 at all, or were the F4s already on the carriers?
Oh no, the squadron was already on the carrier. No, they. In fact, when a carrier deploys, its air wing is aboard. The ship would get underway the ship would be home ported at its, like for the Saratoga, Mayport, Florida, just in the Jacksonville area, was its home port. However, its air wing, the squadrons in its air wing, might be scattered all up and down the East Coast. A6s and F4s were at Oceana. E2s were at NAS Norfolk. The A7s at Cecil Field in Florida. Seems to me like there was, let's see, the helicopter squadrons, I'm not sure. But anyway, all up and down the East Coast. And the carrier gets underway, and once it gets into international waters, one of the first things that happens is that all of these squadrons start flying aboard. And the F4s, the fighters usually are the first ones to arrive because they're more fuel critical. And then after a few hours, the air wing is aboard. They've flown aboard. And then the ship makes its transit. The Saratoga, it had to go across the Atlantic, around Cape of Africa, up the Indian Ocean, and into, well, I guess first to the Philippines to resupply or whatever, and then to the into the Tonkin Gulf. It's largely because the Saratoga, like all carriers of its class, were too big to fit through the Panama Canal. So it had to go the long way.
As an F4 pilot in Vietnam, what was your main role during the war?
Actually, we were multitasked. The F4 was a multitask type airplane. We flew air-to-air missions. The vast majority of our flying was air-to-ground. And that air-to-ground might include major air wing strikes against targets in North Vietnam. Might include armed reconnaissance, what we call armed reconnaissance, 2, 3, and sometimes maybe 4 plane missions looking for what we call targets of opportunity, this sort of thing. We also flew what we call BARCAP, Barrier Combat Air Patrol, to mostly as a screening defense for the carrier itself. We also flew support for the Arclight strikes, which is the code name given to these massive B-52 strikes into North Vietnam. Whenever we flew into South Vietnam, it was almost exclusively air to ground, and in support of operations on the ground. We worked with forward air controllers who would designate our targets for us, and here again it was mostly air to ground.
Could you describe some of your most memorable missions during the war?
Yeah, one of the most memorable ones was my very first, not my first mission, but my first major air wing strike. We were part of about a 30 plane strike group going to a place called Phu Ly. It was just south of the Hanoi area. In fact, kind of on the outskirts of Hanoi, I guess. And our squadron executive officer was the strike leader that day for that strike group. And I remember him telling us in the briefing beforehand that they didn't anticipate much in the way of anti-aircraft activity. Before we got to the target area, they had fired 39 missiles at the strike group, not to mention anti-aircraft artillery that we had to face coming out. So he was a little bit wrong on that one. That was probably one of the more memorable ones, that first one. Recall seeing the flak from the anti-aircraft artillery, and reminded me of the old TV programs I used to watch as a kid of World War II, and wondering what that really looked like. As far as the surface-to-air missiles, that was quite the experience dealing with those. And I guess another really memorable one was one of the last missions we flew. We were doing some bombing along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Actually, we were in Laos. And Laos was always kind of a nerve-wracking sort of thing, because if you got shot down, the Pathet Lao were not known for taking prisoners. And if you got shot down, you were pretty far inland. So the effort to mount a successful rescue those odds were stacked a lot against you. And like I said, this was one of our last last missions, and we were on the dive run and felt the airplane jerk, and I thought, oh good grief, been hit. But it wasn't. It was, I guess, an anomaly or something like that. But I thought, no, not right here toward the end of the cruise or end of the deployment. But we were well into the dive run, in a 45-degree dive, and that happened. Good grief, we've been hit. But fortunately, it turned out not to be the case.
Could you describe what it was like being a pilot during the war? Maybe like a typical day that you had during the war.
Well, it would kind of depend. It wasn't unusual at all to fly twice a day. Morning, of course you wake up, you get started and get the day started and everything. We'd go down to IOIC, the ship's Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, for an overview brief. Just a general intelligence brief. And it would depend on the mission itself. If this was a major strike, then a good part of our briefing would take place down at the ship's intelligence center. And that's where we would all be together, and this strike leader would brief us. And then we'd go back to our individual ready rooms, squadron ready rooms, and would brief the specifics for what we were going to do ourselves as far as the targeting and the basic conduct of the flight. Then we'd get suited up and put our flight gear on, go up to the flight deck and pre-flight the aircraft. Do a detailed pre-flight, and then be launched off, go do the mission, come back, and there would normally be a debrief. If anything monumental happened on the flight, like you got hit or anything specifically, you'd go back down to the intelligence center and debrief down there. But other than that, it was just debriefing among yourselves in the squadron for, like yourself and your wingman and this sort of thing. And then, like I said, we might do that twice a day. Then, once we were finished, we had our own administrative duties that we had to do. I was the squadron's public affairs officer and educational services officer, so there were administrative duties assigned with those things that you get done. And then maybe you find time to work out, maybe go up on the flight deck and jog after they were finished respotting aircraft, and of course after when flight ops were finished. And then after dinner, usually got together in the ready room again and watch a movie in the evening, which would be they weren't first run movies, but it was something to do, basically. But then it would vary. I mean, there'd be times when our carrier might be what we call the Alpha Strike carrier, which meant that everything we did were major strikes. Missions like into North Vietnam. Otherwise, it would just be individual 2, 3, 4 plane missions, armed reconnaissance, this sort of thing. The carrier did flight operations in what we call cyclic ops. They would launch a flight, and then before recovering the planes from that flight, they'd launch the next flight, then recover the first flight. Then they would launch the third flight, and then recover the second. It's called cyclic operations, cyclic ops. Once in a while, or every so often, the ship would, what we call, stand down to do UNREP, underway replenishment. The ship to take on fuel and supplies, ammunition, bombs and bullets and stuff like that. And usually when that went on, it was an 8 or 10 hour deal. We loved it because there was nothing for us in the air wing to do. I mean, so we were either just doing our administrative stuff or, whatever. We didn't actually get involved in that. That was usually the ship's company that took care of all that. So it was almost like a day off for us, or a half day off, or whatever. Then somewhere in between there, you find time to eat and sleep and get cleaned up and do all that sort of stuff. It's a busy, high-paced, fast-paced life. It really, really was.
From what you've talked about, it sounds that you had in Vietnam a fairly positive experience. Do you think that since you were a pilot in Vietnam and you didn't see any ground combat and you weren't and you could come back to a carrier at night, do you think that you had a very different experience? And do you think that you may view the war in a different way because of that?
First of all, yes, I did have a different experience, and as I've told many people, I didn't see anywhere near the worst of it. I mean, not at all. I didn't have to spend the night in a foxhole, or I didn't have to spend the night in the jungle under a driving rain. Didn't have to worry about stepping on a landmine or something like that. I'm not going to say life aboard a carrier is plush by any means. It's not like a cruise ship. But at the same time, like I mentioned, I didn't experience the worst of it. At least we had a carrier to go back to. Wasn't like the Air Force, though, that flew back to Ubon Air Force Base in Thailand or whatever. But at the same time, like I said, it wasn't like the Marines that spend the night in the rain out in some foxhole someplace, or trading bullets with the enemy. Me personally, I don't think that difference in experience per se would have changed my view of the war. When I started out in college, I was very much in favor of the war. Oh yeah, we need to draw the line against communism right here. By the time I had gotten to Vietnam, and then during flight training, of course I was so focused on that Vietnam was like a whole world away, literally. because I was so focused on training. But having experienced it firsthand, I steadily and rather quickly became disillusioned with the war. The manner in which it was being fought, just the whole thing was somewhat became very disillusioning to me. And I don't think the particular experience itself would have dictated that. I don't think it would have had any effect on it. In retrospect, I just don't think it's something that we should have gotten involved in. Not to the extent that we did. I think it was a gross lack of foresight. We were going up against an enemy who had outlasted the French. We were going up against an enemy that we ended up fighting their war. And by their war, I mean fighting according to their game plan. And that's tough. That's very tough, especially for a country like the United States that is not accustomed to long, drawn-out wars. We don't handle that very well. And especially when you have a situation like the draft. That was like throwing fuel on the fire. We've been in Afghanistan now longer than we were in Vietnam. But we don't see the outrage over Afghanistan. And a lot of that is because there isn't a draft. All of the military who are over there are volunteers. Well, they may not have volunteered to go to Iraq, but they were in the military. They're not draftees. I think that's the only reason you're not seeing the outrage over Afghanistan like we did over Vietnam. Plus, the war itself, it was a much more destructive war in Vietnam. Nowadays we might lose 2 people a week, 3 people a week in Afghanistan. Back then we were losing like 100 a week, things like that. So, 58,000 dead, not to mention all the thousands wounded or whatever. And we never really knew what we had to show for it during the whole war. Oh, we had these sugar-coated explanations, and we're stopping communism dead in its track, and this sort of thing. Do we want to fight them in Vietnam, or do we want to fight them on the shores of the United States? Which is bogus. But I became disillusioned with it when I was over there because of the manner in which it was being fought, the manner in which we were compelled to fight it. And I think it's sad that that lesson didn't remain at the forefront, because we ended up doing the same thing in Afghanistan, and to a certain extent the same thing in Iraq. That it's almost like some things never change. So I'm not sure that I would have come to that conclusion had I not experienced that. I don't know. Or it may have taken me a lot longer to come to that same conclusion.
Do you think how do you think your experience compared in war to someone who was drafted, as opposed to you who had chosen to go down that in that career?
Well, everyone, I think almost everyone who served as an officer in Vietnam was a volunteer. If you look at it in terms of, I mean, having said that, if you look at it in terms of how do I view my experience compared to, say, an officer in another service or whatever that may not have been drafted, but served in order to keep from getting drafted. In other words, would not have ordinarily joined the military. I certainly don't, I don't think it gives me a more favorable view of the war itself. And I think incidentally I'm a little bit different than most veterans in that regard. I think most of them tend to feel that we were probably justified being there and should have stayed to win it, and you know, this sort of thing. I didn't really feel that way. I mean, I just felt we never should have gotten involved in it. And that became more apparent to me as time went on.
During your times in when you're doing bombing raids or air-to-air missions,
Mm-hmm.
what were your emotional reactions during those times?
A combination. Well, a certain degree of fear, but fear in a good kind of, I say a good kind of way, a constructive way. Not a debilitating kind of fear, but a motivating kind of fear that motivates you to focus. Focus on procedures. Focus on, I mean, it's a clear type of thing where your training takes over. And I have to say that being in a combat situation, there is a certain element of, I guess the word I'm looking for is excitement, that you can't really match anyplace else, or that the places where you can match that are very few and far between, and in many cases are not very nice things. And that type of excitement, almost a euphoric type of thing, it's kind of dangerous in a way, because you can get to liking it and feed on it. When that happens on a large scale, like a national scale, then you end up with a warlike country which becomes much more prone, much more given to the military option. Whereas in reality, the military option should be the last resort. It's just kind of an observation that I've had for some time. So that degree of adrenaline or whatever it is that makes this combat situation attractive. Like I said, it can be dangerous because I think it can become addictive, and it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing at all.
Could you talk briefly about your communication with home, or how you communicated with home?
Letters, that was it. There was no email. Telephone, you could call home, I guess, when the ship pulled into port, like into Subic Bay in the Philippines, QB Point Naval Air Station, right adjacent to it. You could go to any phone, pay phone, I guess, or whatever, and call home. Getting through was sometimes tough. I never did it myself, so my only communication were letters, strictly mail, and because of that, you live for the mail. I mean, every time I went into the ready room, I checked my box to see if there were letters there or anything like that. So the whole thing about soldiers and sailors and airmen or whatever looking for letters from home, that sort of thing is very real, because that was really the only way we had of communicating.
Could you talk about your time in the Blue Angels and what you did during your time with them?
Yeah, my position with the Blues, I was the number 8 member on the team, the events coordinator. I basically set up, I liaisoned, worked with sponsoring organizations at our various show sites, worked very close with the FAA, pretty much coordinated the whole program. I did air show scheduling, I wrote the schedule. Also did public relations. I was also the public affairs in charge of that. A very fast pace tour of duty. At any given time, I might have a half dozen show sites that I was working on. Some of them would have problems, support problems. We'd fly air shows at a number of civilian airports where they wouldn't have the support equipment that we needed, starters and things like that we needed. So they would have to be transferred in or trucked in from some military base, Naval Air Station, or Air Force Base or something like that. And a lot of these civilian sponsors didn't really have the knowledge of how to do that because they weren't accustomed to working with the military. And so I would have to jump in and kind of take the lead on that. And also I scheduled all of our activities at a show site, things we did, whether it's high school visits, hospital visits, media appearances, social events, things like that. I scheduled, coordinated all of that. Basically just coordinated the whole program. Like I said, it was a fast-paced couple of years. For 2 years, I never totally unpacked a suitcase. We were constantly on the road. But it was quite an experience. It really was. And well, quite an experience getting selected to do that. And I guess I allow myself a certain degree of well, I guess you could call it pride or whatever, in knowing that throughout our 65-year history of the Blue Angels, consider all of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of naval aviators throughout the 100-year of this being the 100th anniversary of naval aviation. Consider all the, maybe into the millions or whatever of people that experience naval aviation. Less than 300 have worn that blue flight suit. And by golly, I'm one of them. So that that was something I feel a pretty good degree of accomplishment about.
Transitioning into talking about the end of the war, what were you doing when the war ended?
I was flying off of the Saratoga. When the war ended.
Yes.
We left the line late January, I guess, of 1973. The war ended a few weeks later. I don't remember when the actual truce or papers were signed in Paris. I don't remember the specific date, but we may very well have been transiting back to the United States when that happened. It took us about a month to get back, because we had to go back the same way that we went. Down through the Indian Ocean, around Africa, and up the Atlantic. So it was about a month-long transit. And I don't remember when specifically the, like I said, that peace finally broke out. We may very well have been in transit. But I know as soon as we got back to Oceana, about 2 or 3 days later, I went on a month's leave. So if it hadn't happened before then, it happened when I was on leave. So I was either on the Saratoga on the way back to the U.S., or I was back in Missouri when the war ended, officially ended. We left the line, and then a few, about 2 weeks later, the America left the line to come home. At one point, there were 6 carriers in the Tonkin Gulf during that phase of the war, and that's the first time since World War II that many aircraft carriers had operated together. And that was a rather confined area for 6 carriers. When most of them were conducting flight operations, and when a carrier conducts flight ops, it has to have a steady course, straightaway type thing. It can't be maneuvering. It's launching and recovering aircraft. Yeah, I do remember seeing on TV, I guess I was back home at the time, the release of a lot of the POWs. But as far as when the war actually ended, we recently had our 65th anniversary reunion, the Blue Angels, in Pensacola. In fact, it was last month. And one of the sad notes was one of the leaders of the Blues. In fact, I was in flight training. The Blues were flying the F-4 at the time. And one of the leaders of the Blues when I was in flight training, Commander Harley Hall, very dynamic individual. In fact, they flew a show in Pensacola, and I wasn't able to go to that show because I was busy studying for a pretty crucial, yes, it was a radar electronics test coming up or whatever. And I opted not to go to the show, to stay in my room in the bachelor officer's quarters and study. Boss Hall was probably the leader of the team at that time. Little did I know I'd end up with that outfit years later. But after he finished his tour on the team, he went back to the fleet, commanded an F-4 squadron. I don't remember which carrier, but he was shot down on the last day of the war and was lost. I think all indications are that he made it out of the airplane and on the ground fine, but I think he was killed by the North Vietnamese who found him. But that was the last day of the war. Yeah, that was a good thing to have over.
Could you talk a little bit about what was it like when you got home? A little bit about how your family and your community and your friends received you.
Family, certainly received me with open arms. Same thing with family members. I was Springfield, Missouri. It's a solid Midwestern town. Very traditional family values, or traditional values. Family, country, red, white, and blue, apple pie, ice cream, that sort of stuff. For the most part, at that time. You could not say as much for a lot of other areas in the country. And I guess one of the things that hurt the most was the indifference, the skepticism, it's like you tell people that you were in Vietnam and they look at you like, and you weren't smart enough to avoid it. You weren't smart enough to stay out of the military, to avoid military service. And also, maybe a little bit of, maybe more than a little bit, of distrust, because you represented the military, which represented the government, which represented a lot of lies and misinformation in the eyes of a lot of people because of Vietnam. Vietnam was, especially down toward the end of the war and after the war, there was a confidence gap, a trust gap between the country, I guess, and its government. Now, that's common today. I mean, nobody trusts the government or whatever. But it was a new thing back then. I mean, Vietnam Vietnam told a lot of people, or a lot of people perceived for the first time, that they could be lied to by their government. And I do believe that a lot of the animosity toward the military was because the military was what was visible to them. It was their way of voicing their disgust to the misinformation, the misrepresentation, and things like that on the part of the government. And the military bore the brunt of that in so many ways. Now, that's not to say that the military was without blame for part of that. Especially on the higher levels of the military. On the Pentagon level, the high levels of the Pentagon, the advisors to the president, and this sort of thing. But the military in general, I think, bore a lot of the brunt of the disgust, frustration that a lot of people had with Vietnam and Vietnam in general. And that stayed around for a number of years. I noticed when I was with the Blue Angels, we made almost all of our show sites would make campus visits to colleges and to high schools to make presentations about naval aviation, about what we did in the Blues and what naval aviation's all about and that sort of thing. Most of the time were received pretty warmly, but I think it was mostly on the college campuses that there was still a lot of skepticism or so. And that was in the mid-70s, 74, 75 time frame, which was only, 2 years after the war. By the early 80s, 1981, that time frame there, that had started to change. But I guess that was, one of the things that hurt the most was coming home and in fact, there were some places, Washington, D.C., for example, that we were advised not to wear a uniform in public, that we could incur physical danger. And that was tough. That was probably as tough as anything. It really was.
Real quick, because we only have a few minutes left, how did you readjust to regular life back home?
Well, I was still in the Navy and still stayed in the Navy, so it wasn't really a problem. Living in the Norfolk area, Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, that's military and retired military. I mean, one day I was driving down the street and just for yucks, I counted the cars that I met, just to see how many of them had stickers on them, like base stickers. It was something like 9 out of 10 or whatever. So it wasn't hard in that regard. That came, the challenge there came in late 1977 when I left the military. In early 78 when I entered the civilian workforce. It was a little different. It was not being in kind of the regimented, routine of knowing what's expected of you, or knowing what's expected of you, and this. I mean, just the little things of figuring out what you're going to wear that day. It was different, not in a major negative kind of way or whatever. So I guess I would say that I didn't really experience a tremendous shock or whatever. Adjusting. It was more of a phased in kind of thing, I guess. It wasn't that traumatic for me at all.
And now that you've had some time to look back on the war and reflect on it, how do you think the war has affected you as a person, and what do you think that you've learned from your time in the war?
I think one of the main things that, two big things. First of all, it kind of gave me a good baseline. I mean, regardless of what has happened bad to me, I can always say, well, it's not like going to Hanoi, or it's not like getting shot at, or it's not as bad as a night approach to the boat, that sort of thing. And that's not, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of truth in that. The other thing, it has caused me to, I think, have a more open outlook and viewpoint toward things on the governmental scene, I guess. In other words, not take so many things at face value, but I noticed, I mean, I keep in touch a lot with my colleagues, people from that time frame, and many of them are really geared toward the military solution. Everything has a military solution. And I think it has helped me to realize that that solution should be strictly a last resort. That it should always be on the table. That it should always be on the table. But, and it should always be considered as one of the options. But it's not the obvious solution. And what I've seen in subsequent years has been, I think, a validation of that, of that feeling that I can only see, just off the top of my head, I can only think of one instance where that option worked as advertised. And that was in Bosnia, where a military intervention stopped basically, maybe it wasn't a genocide, but it wasn't that far from it. And that there doesn't seem to have been any major negative repercussions from that, or whatever. Whereas most everything else that we've done militarily has either ended up in, without a well-defined outcome, or we're still involved in it, like Iraq and Afghanistan Same thing with other countries. You know, the Russians in Afghanistan, that they had about the same results there that we did in Vietnam. So I guess has given me a very sobering view of the military option. That it has to be on the table, like I said, and there are times when it probably has to be used, but it should be used very sparingly, only when necessary, and to its fullest extent when it is used. That there's really no such thing as limited warfare. And I was really impressed with President Eisenhower's view of that. That if you're going to use the military, use everything you got in a conventional manner and get it over with. Otherwise, you end up dragging it out, and that's what's happened in every situation where we've done that. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. He seems to have been right on that. And then the one thing that he said once when he was president, God help my successors who don't know the military like I do. So it's that whole military option is like I said, it's a very valid type thing. You have to have it. You have to have it available. It needs to be strong. It needs to be effective. But it also takes a very mature and a very, very careful and considered decision process to use that with all of the consequences considered. So I guess it has given me that. Vietnam has given me that. It's not to be considered lightly. And I've said it's not a strong military that is the solution to things. It's the wise use of a strong military. And that's where we have come up short too many times, I think. It's the wise use of it.
I think that's all our time. Thank you very much. This interview was done in affiliation with Durham Academy Artistic and Literature Response to War class. Thank you.